Hello, how are you? Today's topic is physiology of the respiratory system. So I'm going to break down the main parts of the physiology, respiratory physiology, tell you a little bit about them, and then in future videos I'll break down some of those further and discuss a little bit more detail. Respiratory system physiology can be broken down into four main parts. Part 1, pulmonary ventilation. 2, external respiration. 3, gas transport. And 4, internal respiration. What happens in pulmonary ventilation is we're moving air in or out. Moving air in, inhaling, inspiration. Moving air out, exhaling, is expiration. The movement of air requires contraction of muscles. So there's a set of muscles involved in pulmonary ventilation, and contraction of these muscles is going to do one of two things. Either squeeze your thoracic cavity and therefore squeeze your lungs. That's going to make them smaller and push air out, expiration. Or some muscles contract to expand the thorax, and that's also going to expand the volume of the lungs. And that's going to act to suck air in, inspiration. You can think of the system, pulmonary ventilation, as basically how a bellows works. If you've ever used a bellows to fan a flame, then you close the bellows, you're squeezing the chamber, forcing air out, or you open the chamber, expand it to suck air in. That's basically what's happening in pulmonary ventilation. In external respiration, now air that has entered into the lungs goes to the small sacs in the lungs called the alveoli. And when you take oxygen in, that oxygen is going to be transferred into the bloodstream. So this is representing an alveolus here. This is representing a blood vessel, a capillary surrounding the alveolus. Oxygen is going to move down a pressure gradient from inside the alveolus air into the bloodstream. CO2 is going to move in the opposite direction. It's also driven by pressure gradients. It's going to move out of the bloodstream into the air. So you would take in oxygen inhalation that goes into the bloodstream. When you exhale, you're exhaling a lot of CO2 that's escaped from the bloodstream. Number 3, gas transport. So once oxygen enters the bloodstream, in the lungs, it has to be transported in the body. And for oxygen, what happens is it binds to hemoglobin inside of red blood cells, and that's the main way that oxygen is transported in the bloodstream. CO2 is also transported. CO2 can transport by one of two ways, either bound to hemoglobin, or some CO2 dissolves in the blood plasma and combines with water in the plasma to form carbonic acid. This is a bidirectional reaction, so it can form or it can, it can degrade, and degradation releases CO2. If that happens in the plasma in the lungs, CO2 is going to escape into the air inside the alveoli. Internal respiration is the last part, and this is gas exchange that's happening, in this case, in the tissues. So when oxygen enters the blood and the lungs, it circulates to the tissues, and then oxygen is going to travel out of the bloodstream into the interstitial fluid surrounding the cells in the tissues. In internal respiration, oxygen is diffusing down a pressure gradient from the bloodstream into the interstitial fluid. CO2 is also diffusing. Its pressure gradient favors movement of CO2 from an area of high pressure where cells are forming CO2 by breaking down fuel molecules, and that's going to travel down the pressure gradient into the bloodstream. So you can see this is the opposite, what's happening in internal respiration versus external respiration. In external respiration, O2 is entering the blood. In internal respiration, O2 is leaving the blood. And external respiration, CO2 is leaving the bloodstream, and internal respiration, CO2 is entering the bloodstream. So that's a brief summary of the main functions that happen in the respiratory system. As far as our coverage, we'll mostly talk about number 1 and number 2. Very little, if any more, about number 3. And I might mention very briefly number 4 as well, but we're going to focus mostly on these 2. How do those work? And what are the factors involved in both? All right, catch you next time.